talking about wisdom. And I wanted to start out with a little trivia to see if any of you can guess who said these famous quotes. Here's the first one. Named must your fear be, before banish it you can. Okay? Do or do not, there is no try. Here's the third one. Fear is the path, dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Some of you may be guessing now, but I'm going to give you one. I think this will give it away. When 900 years you reach, look as good you will not. Now, some of you may be thinking that this famous person or famous character who said these things, I think some of you guessed this is Yoda from the Star Wars movies. There's at least one Star Wars person in the back. I see, thank you very much, and you knew it was. My 16-year-old son actually guessed it too when I said these quotes to him, so I was pleased that the knowledge has passed down to another generation. Yoda was that backward-speaking little wise creature in the Star Wars movies. And if you're not familiar with him, you might think of some other wise characters you know from movies or from TV shows. And if we go back to the 50s, if anybody was around in the 50s or 60s, there were a lot of TV shows, or you can watch them on TV Land now if you weren't alive then. Father Knows Best, y'all remember that one? You remember Ozzie Nelson? Or what about North Carolina's own Sheriff Andy Taylor? You know, he would dispense all this homegrown wisdom with a southern drawl, and I liked that as a little girl. But also, some of you maybe can think of some wise people from your own lives. Think for just a minute. Picture in your head what the wise people that you would go to for advice. Who would you go to if you needed help with a very difficult problem? Well, for me and for my sister, one of the wise people in our lives has always been my dad. My dad, his name is Enloe. And our dad always had these little nuggets of wisdom, things that he would tell us. Things like, you know, those switches on the wall that you turn up to turn the lights on. If you turn them down, the lights go off when you walk out of the room. You see, he has always been about being very, very frugal. And he thought that was wise to be frugal. He also taught us that sometimes, instead of arguing with someone when an argument was really not going to go anywhere, the best thing to do was just to go fishing, just to leave it. And that was his solution to a lot of things. But my sister and I call the little sayings that he says, we call them Enloeisms because that's his first name. And one of my favorite Enloeisms has to be when I'm given the opportunity to play a game to win a prize. Now, I've been to Vegas and Atlantic City just once each. And while I was there, this Enloeism came to me. He would always say, you can't win at the other man's game. You can't win at the other man's game. See, when we went to the beach, rarely, and went to Myrtle Beach and the boardwalk, or maybe we'd go to the Cleveland County Fair or another county fair, there'd be the smell of cotton candy and excitement. And my sister and I would beg for money. And he'd give us a few coins, and we'd go off and play skee ball or try to throw something at a target to win a teddy bear or some other dust-collecting prize. And that's what he'd say to us. You can't win at the other man's game. You know, sometimes I think that he probably stood at the foot of our beds when we were little and repeated that just so we would not gamble. You can't win at the other man's game. You can't win at the other man's game. Because that echoed in my head when we went to Atlantic City and the one time I went to Las Vegas. I just couldn't throw any money down on the wheel and gamble or do that because I knew that that's what my dad was saying in my head. There are lots of wise people that we can think about. And the wise people that I know have always been those people who are humble and those people who are always seeking, the people who are always looking for something beyond themselves. They're always students, they're always growing, and they're always questioning. And when I think about wisdom, I also think about Proverbs. In the Bible, that is one of the books of wisdom. And in this chapter of Proverbs, we are introduced to wisdom, and wisdom is pictured as a woman. Now, that's a real surprise, especially considering when this book was written. It was a very, very patriarchal society, and for them to personify wisdom as a woman is an unusual thing, or it seems to me. Now, some people have debated that wisdom is some part of God, or that wisdom is really, they're talking about God here, not wisdom. Some people just point out that the word for wisdom in Hebrew, which is Sophia, that is feminine, and that is why that Lady Wisdom is personified as a woman here. Regardless, not only is wisdom a woman in these verses, but she is also a prophet. And she speaks powerfully and loudly to those who will hear. These are some strong words that we just heard in the scripture. And this is not the words or the way that a genteel southern lady might speak. She is out in the streets, in the intersection of the streets, and she's speaking in the bustling intersection of our lives. It's not in quiet meditation or in a beautiful sanctuary, and it's not a private conversation. You see, God is like that. God is always seeking us out where we are, and it's up to us to listen. God is ever searching, ever calling, ever reaching, ever challenging us. Wisdom talks about three categories of people in this book. She talks about first the young or the immature, those the simple ones who lack knowledge, but they have the potential to grow and learn. And then there are the scoffers. These are the skeptics who reject the principles of retribution or taking their own accountability for consequences for what they've done. And then there are the fools. Those are the ones who are incorrigible and are wicked and immoral. Listen to verse 22 again. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? In other words, how long before we mature and grow up in our faith, or we leave that skepticism behind and quit insisting that we are sufficient in and of ourselves? Or how long before we acknowledge that what we do matters and what we reap we sow? It's a lot to think about in these verses. And Proverbs is kind of like that. It's like an onion that you peel layer and layer off, and there's more and more to it. Yesterday, I was thinking about coming to speak with you today, and I was at the Apple Festival with 100,000 or so of my closest friends. It was really packed. I don't know if any of you went yesterday, but it was a big crowd, and I spent most of the day at the best place, the happiest place, right there at the UMR Art Center, and watched all the hustle and bustle going on. And there happened to be a couple of street preachers who came along. Now, you may have seen folks that do this. There were two of them. One was a tall, thin man and a shorter man. They were both working the streets. And they were dressed in suits, and it was hot. So they were sweating, and they were yelling, and they were telling us where we were going to go in no uncertain terms. And I looked at the reaction of the people around them, and I thought, wow, is this what Lady Wisdom might have been like, the street scene where she was speaking to people? Because mostly, I think people were irritated, or maybe they were amused by him, and maybe a few people were a little frightened by him. I think he really, or both of these preachers, I think they were really missing the point completely. You see, the wisdom of God shouts to us in a whole different way. Nothing speaks louder than when we see our brothers and our sisters in need. And nothing opens our hearts or clears out our ears more than the cry of a hungry child. Nothing demands our attention more than a family who has lost their home. And nothing reaches us more clearly than the hopeful eyes of someone who's in need of a hug or encouragement or a message of hope. I can see by hearing everything that's going on here in the life of this church and on your bulletin board about your missions, that this is a church that hears the call of God and answers it. And I think that's what shouts to us. that's what we hear. Here these preachers were, they were desperately shouting, trying to scare us, and what I think we really need is for our blinders to be removed and for us to look around and really see the needs right around us. You know, where we work and where we go to school, where we go out to eat, where we worship, where we put gas in our cars, where we buy our groceries, where we drive our cars every day and see the needs of all the broken people all around us. Because you see, we're all broken, just in different ways. And I think what we really need is a little fermentation. Yes, fermentation. Now that seems like an odd thing to say, perhaps, but let me explain. As I was mulling over all the words of Lady Wisdom this week, I heard a radio program, and I heard this expert talk about fermentation in food. His name is Sandor Katz. And he wrote a book called Wild Fermentation. And they were interviewing him, and he was talking about how all cultures seem to have this one or two or maybe more foods that are part of their cultural heritage that are passed down from generation to generation where people ferment certain foods like cucumbers or cabbage or milk products. He talks about how the culture of these fermented foods are woven into the cultures of the people, and they're very important to them. You see, fermented food uses bacteria, and my 16-year-old pointed out to me that this is an anaerobic process that they ferment, and it enhances the flavor of the food. It changes. You see, the food is transformed through the fermenting process. And it also came to my attention that a lot of my favorite foods are a part of the process that makes them is fermentation. Chocolate. Did you know that chocolate, there's a fermentation process to begin? How chocolate is made from the cacao beans that are split open, and they're allowed to ferment in the sun, and that's how we get the chocolate that we enjoy so much today. And then there's coffee, bread, all some of my favorite things. And then there are the more obvious fermented things like pickles and yogurt and cheeses of all kinds. Now, I remember that my Aunt Nanny, who canned a lot of food, a lot of it were foods that were fermented. You know, pickled cucumbers and okra. I mean, she even made pickled peaches, if some of you have ever had pickled peaches. And I really like the taste of fermented food. It's a little twang to it, a little bite. Nothing like a good blue cheese or a crisp dill pickle. But usually fermented foods are not the main attraction in a meal. They're an accent. And that fermentation, that sharpness, cuts through and makes whatever you're eating taste a little bit better. I mean, when you get a sandwich from a deli, often you get a dill pickle with that, right? If you make sauerkraut, you might put some smoked sausage and sauerkraut together or put it on a sandwich. Then there's that pizza chain. You know, they have the big pizzas, and they have those hot pickled peppers that they have, and I really like those. They cut to the chase, and they enhance the flavor by providing a sharp contrast. But this guy on the radio, as he was talking about all these fermented foods, he was talking about the medicinal properties of fermented foods. They have done some studies to look at cultures where people eat a lot of things that are fermented, and they took a group of people and they removed all the fermented foods, all the yogurts or the sauerkraut or whatever they were eating. They did some tests on them first, and they had really good digestive functions and other bodily functions. Then they took that away, and they were not functioning as well. So then they added back in some probiotics. Y'all seen the yogurt in the supermarket that says probiotics? We've been adding that back in. They gave that back to the study participants, and some of their digestive functions started improving a little bit, but they weren't quite up to the level when they were getting it naturally. You see, I think we have become so afraid of bacteria that we're paranoid about it, and we've removed it all, and there is some good properties to this. Fermented foods are foods that have been transformed, and science is now learning that it's beneficial for normal, healthy bodily function. I couldn't help but think that perhaps in our churches, in our communities, it's time for us to learn a lesson from fermentation. Perhaps what we need is a chemical change an anaerobic process spiritually in our churches to cause some transformation. You know, back in John Wesley's day, he was very particular, or used a particular method by creating small bands and small classes of people where they practiced very intentionally spiritual formation practices like meeting often, praying together, worshiping, Bible study, missional meeting the needs of the people in their community. Fermentation, in a physical sense, brings about an actual structural change in the food. And fermentation spiritually might mean that we add some of these practices back into our lives. And maybe we will begin listening to each other a little bit better and move beyond differences that we might have with one group or another and back to a natural rhythm where we understand what it means to forgive and be forgiven. And we can find the peace that Lady Wisdom mentions in verse 33, where she says, "But those who listen to me will be secure and will live at ease without dread of disaster." Now, that promise of peace at the very end of all these harsh verses doesn't mean that everything's going to be okay all the time. You all know that our lives are not without problems. The promise of peace is not a promise that we'll be free from difficulty or free of pain or freed from those problems. It is a promise that we can rest securely knowing that God will be with us through it all. Do y'all know what John Wesley is reported to have said on his deathbed? They say that what he said as he lifted up his arms and his voice was kind of feeble and he repeated it. He said, "The best of all, God is with us." So perhaps we can learn some lesson today from the wise people in our lives, the wise people in our culture, and perhaps even from the fermentation process about how things occur naturally if we will just practice them. Spiritual fermentation happens when we bring ourselves, we're humble and grateful for the grace of God, and we are willing to let ourselves be transformed into healthier people and be opened up by God to transform the world around us. Another quote from Yoda, "You will find only what you bring in." You see, God calls us to change, to transform, to set aside ourselves and listen to the voice that calls out, even in those busy, busy times of our lives. Have you heard this call? Listen. Lady Wisdom shouts to you in the street. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.